Thank you, Marion, for that presentation. I think by now all participants and people who joined us, they are now familiar or have an insight into the kind of challenges that we come across when we're dealing with this data. And the importance of data, I think no one can underplay it now. Just having seen how much information was shared in the last 2 hours or so. And therefore, going forward, we hope that our partners, our stakeholders, even the public in general, will be keen to share this information, will be keen to provide resources to make information available, having seen the wealth and the worth of the information. However, having promised that we will later on have a panel, I am now joined by a number of panelists in the studio. But I'll first start by introducing the two gentlemen whom you haven't met or heard their voices yet. I have Mr. Mwokeza Ramasodi, the Director General from the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development. Ndadi, kiagamagala studio.
Thank you very much. It's the Deputy Director General. At least I'm accused of taking and annexing DG's post.
Yes, Deputy Director General. Sorry for that mistake. Thank you so much. And we are also joined by the Chief Economist from AgBase, who is known all over the country, if not all over the world. A renowned author of wonderful books. But today we are here on BFAP Business, Wandile Sihlobo. Wandile, welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
Maybe let me just start with you. Having seen this presentation, and now that we are joined by the two presenters, Ferdy on your left, and then to your right you have Tracy. They have made presentations and you have watched some of those. What is your impression from the perspective of the sector or your own perspective as well?
Yeah, I think generally, firstly, I think it's important to acknowledge that what BFAP is doing is really a great service to the country, because this is information that then gets to be publicly available out there. And my key impression, really, by looking at what has been discussed here, firstly, it's around a confirmation or reaffirming what we have been seeing, that agriculture at a broad level, we have been able to withstand some of the challenges that have been brought by the pandemic. Obviously, also highlighting some of the sectors that did get to find some bit of a glitches in there. I was also more surprised by that when you look at their GDP for agriculture numbers, 13%, that's really good in an economy that will be contracting by more than 7% or so. On our side, we had thought that the number could be somewhere about 10% or so. That's good. But I think at a more fundamental pace for me, it's also around elevating agriculture in the public discussion at a point where we are also in a policy side saying, in terms of jobs, in terms of growth, what should be done where. And I think BFAP zooming down to some of the key preconditions that have come out for development, for growth and job creation in agriculture, that's one of the key important things. And I think that if we are to make progress, we really need to go into those preconditions, prioritize and saying which one should be done with. So generally, I think it's really a useful document.
Okay, thank you so much. And progress is exactly what we need going forward, because we are in a very difficult as well as different time of our lives. But to you, Mwokeza, I'll ask you the same question about basically your impression as well. I know that year after year, we have representative from your department, not one, not two, but more than 10, attending the traditional BFAP launch. So, but this is a different year. So I get an opportunity to ask you your impression of this year's baseline launch.
No, thank you very much for that question. I think let me start by congratulating BFAP for yet another good deposition in terms of the agricultural industry. It's very important that we also recognize the work that is being done by your good selves, the partners that you have, and the board in general in terms of BFAP. What you have done this year, I think, in a year where we are experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic, is to paint a very good picture in terms of how agriculture can be a sector that can lead this economy out of the recession. Very important in terms of now the outlines that we are having and the projections that we are having. That as government, with the deep dives that BFAP has done, we come up with a policy space that would enhance agricultural production in different sectors through the district development model, to ensure that as a country we are able to show at household level, at national level, we have got food security and we are able to create jobs that are needed within the sector. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And you really put your finger on it when you describe the positive picture, but as well as also the challenges that Wandile has mentioned. But we'll look into some of those as we get deeper into the discussion. Ferdy, just to put you on the spot, you have done this 17 times, but this year was the first time when you looked around, there were no audience. You couldn't see someone panicking, you couldn't see someone nodding. So it might have been a different experience. Do you mind just sharing that experience of presenting to a different set of audience or from a different position than the last 16 years?
Yeah, so thanks, Matlo. I think the biggest change was, and really this was it's a fantastic team thinking about what are the opportunities in a situation that was actually bad for us. We really look forward to a baseline where we can meet and greet and we can see our partners and we can see our colleagues and really engage in a personal way. And I think this is a very common challenge for everyone who does a conference or some kind of an event where you really want to engage with people. And we sat down and we said, what's the opportunity out of all of this? And really to go to ensure that we actually have far bigger reach of this event was the benefit. And looking at those numbers as people were logging in, and you could see here are 500 people logged in listening, and you at least know a lot of them, you familiarize with their faces. We looked at the comments coming in, and I think it's been a good experience for us. And going forward, it might be a combination, who knows? But we're also looking forward to comments. But we're grateful to have it in such a way. We definitely miss our people, but the reach to go global and to have regional impact and to have really just a broader base of people logging in. It's been a great experience.
All right. Thank you. I think you have just turned, that's what you said, or that's what I take from your discussion, that you turned a situation that was negative largely into a positive, saying that we had an audience of 500 people. In the past, we are limited by venue and participants are limited by traffic and other commitments, but we managed to use that opportunity to reach as many people as possible, to reach people all over the world. And therefore, out of every situation, you can find a positive outcome, and we'll see how agriculture does that. But now I want to turn to Tracy. You had a marathon presentation, presenting a lot of details, but also not just details, looking forward, which is usually, if not always, a very difficult thing to do because you don't know what tomorrow holds. And the presentation of an outlook is grounded as well as anchored by a set of assumptions. But the common assumption that we normally include is the fact that we expect the future to be normal or to be similar to the past. We assume that there aren't extreme, conditions. However, this was not a normal year, all right? So just how was the preparation of the outlook? I know that behind you there's a team, but you are the face of the team at this moment. How was just this presentation of the future in the current climate looking like? But how does this also take us to that future that we want? Do you want to share a little bit around that? Because it's not an easy task, I can tell you that.
Thank you, Matlo. Yeah, so we always, for the baseline, we always need to put the disclaimer that it's one possible outcome, right? So it's based on a set of assumptions that we feel is a plausible outcome. And of course, the nice thing of it is that there's an analytical system behind it. So yes, you do have to make some assumptions. And yes, this year, those assumptions were a lot more uncertain than what they would normally be. That certainly has made our life maybe a little bit more difficult, but I think it's also given us a great opportunity. So essentially what the baseline does is it considers the fundamentals that underpin the sector and gives you a view on the direction in which the sector is going. But from that, it actually really just presents the starting point. So now when you have the system underpinning it, you can now start with further analysis. You can look at different scenarios. You can see how these assumptions might change, how things might play out. As we get bits more of information, we can utilize that and feed that into the system and see how this outlook might change, how the view might change. So in that sense, it gives us a firm starting point for further analysis. But it also gives us a lot of opportunities to evaluate different outcomes and how one might respond to the situation as it unfolds.
Thank you, and I agree that at the same time, I think there was also an opportunity to learn, because the event we're talking about here hasn't happened in the last 100 years. So in other words, we're dealing with a situation that no one or most of us alive today have never seen, and therefore we had to work through that. And here we had a wonderful presentations today. But now that I have a panel and I've asked for participants to send questions, I've received a number of questions. Just maybe to go back to the participants, that the panel will discuss some of the questions, but others will be responded through the platform or other means through which BFAP communicates. So I just want to go to the first question that I have received. It comes from Johan van Rooyen, and if I'm not mistaken, is Prof. Johan van Rooyen. He's asking, and any one of you can just go first, tackle this question, that why do we support, promote, or sustain uncompetitive enterprises? Is that the best benefit or the best use of resources? Or, to frame it slightly different, just to extend it, he's also asking, since we mentioned support a lot of time, what do you do when you have a sector or an industry that is not responsive to the support or to some incentives that are out there? Is that question clear? But I think it's a very important question, because the word support came quite a number of times throughout the presentation. Fedi, do you want to go first, maybe, in addressing Johan's question?
Yeah, thanks, Matlo. I'll give it a go, and then you must also. So I think one point that Johan is referring to is we mentioned policy support, and we talked about the wheat industry. So we had a big decline. If you really look at the history of the wheat industry, we've had 1 million hectares decline, basically disappearing in the Free State. And partly climatic, but also a lot of support coming in those days from the wheat board. And those hectares did not disappear. They basically, depending on the remote sensing work and the type of analyses, it's about 600,000 hectares that remained in field crops, and the other 400 went back into pasture. So something is happening there. There are changes, and the question is, can we support industries? There are pockets where it makes sense, but it's not only a blunt instrument of piling on tariffs. We should not do that. We should see it in a package of what the wheat industry is doing in terms of breeding, in terms of grading system, quality, and similar type of exercises we can run for other industries. So there are definitely, in terms of support, there are industries where we can grow more in terms of exports if we can support and unlock idle resources. And I think that's what it's all about, is unlocking idle resources where we have already capital flowing in, but we're not making the connections yet. And this is where this idea of value chains comes in, where you have a working together between public and private sector, and you need a catalyst at the right spot. And a lot of time that catalyst, we miss it. And that's, I think, where we can unlock a number of idle potential that's still sitting in the industry.
If maybe I may just add a little bit to add onto Fedi's point. But I think if we look at agriculture, a type of support that we've really been getting at a large space is really on a trade policy side. It's not that there's been active capital that is coming into a large proportion. But I think onto that, we have to think back to the point that Fedi is raising. You think about the poultry sector, for example. What is the key issue? Is it on the feed side? Or is it, and then I think we need to be thoughtful about the instruments that we are using for that support. And also then just going on the ground level of saying, do we really have a comparative advantage to this industry? Or should we be doing other things on the side? But I think for these two industries that we have mentioned, we can thrive, but we just need to know what type of a support do we offer.
Maybe to latch on the points that have been made by Fedi and Wandi. And I'm happy that he raises the issue around the wheat industry and the history that comes with it, because most of the data that you see people projecting would be the data coming from almost 1996 onwards. This is very important in terms of the lost 1 million hectares. But it's very important then to change the question into an answer, to say, what do we do going forward in terms of determining which of these sectors can be competitive and can be supported? And that is where the government perspective in terms of the agriculture and agro-processing master plan comes in, because you start identifying through the deep dives that have been done by a BFAP, by NAMAC, to say which are those industries that we can support, that are competitive, that have got competitive advantage and comparative advantages, and we move ahead from that side. And just to highlight, we have identified 8 up to this stage, and we think that those are the winners that we will start supporting going forward. And that would also set aside the question that Prof had asked around why are we supporting those that are uncompetitive.
And I think just to extend to your points is that if we look at some of the presentations, the fastest growing, when a breakdown of the industries, you see that the fastest growing are the ones that are, export oriented. They're looking outside and they compete at that level. And therefore your point precisely to say that when you identify them like that and support them to reach that level of competitiveness, then they can shoot forward. Okay, I have received a number of questions and I just combined them into one. And right now, 3 people, but I'll just present a combined question from the 3 participants are based on the presentations that, were made in that. And Wandile, you made that point that agriculture is growing in a very difficult, period, about 13%. And therefore the question generally, it says, is this growth or this overall performance based on the opportunity that we see because agriculture is an essential sector, and therefore it had to operate during the pandemic, or is it just the resilience? Is it opportunistic, or is it the resilience of the sector? Maybe let me start with you, Tracy, because they are asking this on the basis of the numbers that you presented.
Thank you. It's a great question. I think there's multiple aspects to that. So firstly, I would say agriculture is a very resilient sector. I think we've seen that. If you look past the past 5 years, if you look at the drought we had in 2016, many of the factors that Fadi mentioned, animal disease, listeria, weather, it's been a really difficult period the last few years in terms of weather. So it's been exceptionally volatile. But yet we see every time that when we have a good year in terms of weather, the sector really bounces back strongly. At the same time, there has been aspects such as the exchange rate depreciation, which as a primary sector has helped it to be strong here. But the fact that we still operated through the lockdown as an essential service, the fact that the sector worked very well together also with government to make sure that things remained functional. If I think of a product like citrus, the lockdown, that's an industry where production levels have increased based on investment that have been made over the past 5 years. So it's an industry that has reinvested, it has built for the future. Now it had this big crop coming in, it had the lockdown imposed and right at the time where the crop needs to start moving out. And there was a lot of good cooperation between the sector with government to make sure that everything keeps functioning, to make sure that we can get the product out of ports. So it did benefit from the weak rand, but had we not taken those other actions, it wouldn't have been allowed to either. So I think there's good aspects of multiple fronts.
Okay, so there's a bit of both. Anyone wants to add to Tracy's point on this?
I think Tracy has got it right. If you look what happened just at the beginning of the lockdown, government together with industry and BFAP came together to come up with a value chain tracker for the sector. And it was easier to identify those areas where you have got gaps, areas where you have got bottlenecks, and you could go as government to go and untie those or unbottle those. So it's very important in terms of the sector that that cooperation at that level needs to be harnessed and be carried forward. And to this effect, I think some of the issues that we now need to look forward to is how do we enhance that cooperation? How do we enhance the tracker to be something that can be used industry-wide to ensure that these issues where you have got bottlenecks and you don't have that cooperation are dealt with simultaneously to increase the efficiencies within our systems.
Okay. And
I think maybe the one thing that's interesting, and Wandile, you can also help here. It's the what we're picking up if we look back. It's really the industries. We presented these preconditions, and the elements around investment, around market access, around infrastructure, around support. And if we look at if you just dissect these value chains and the performance that we've seen. Those elements are in there. You can see it. Tracy talked about market access in citrus, working together and getting those markets open. And by the way, there's a lot more volume coming, so we need to be ready. And the ports, Tracy, if we look at the numbers, about 40% increased capacity that we need in the next 10 years. So we know if we need to prioritize in terms of infrastructure investment, we know the volumes are underway. We've expanded irrigation hectares by 70,000 hectares since the NDP. That's a lot of volume of fruits and high-value products that are going to come through our ports, and we need to invest in those. So those are kind of preconditions. But in this lockdown period, we saw the value of efficient operations in terms of logistics, in terms of market information. Just imagine, Wandile, you also wrote a lot in March. And we were all projecting saying, don't panic. There is sufficient food and there is sufficient value chains that can deliver this food. And this panic buying, yes, there was panic buying, but the fact that we have a crop estimates committee, we have a S&D committee that NMC is chairing, that we had this vision of what does the food balance sheet look like. I'm not saying by that the impact on low-income vulnerable households is severe. And we know that, and the job losses are severe. But at least to ensure that we have cost-effective food in the system was a big plus, and it's based on these preconditions.
Yeah. If I may just add a brief bite on that. I would say, yes, we are growing, but it's not only just the fact that we were left alone, as Tracy was saying. I mean, we started off already seeing this as a recovery year. Good rains after 2 consecutive years of droughts. So we're already on good footing, and the regulations and us understanding through the pathways that the colleagues have just explained now, were only just enabling us to know where the blockages are. But the hard work of putting the crop on the ground and doing all of those things, that was the work already done. So I would say the sector has been relatively resilient, but having more frequent information, good cooperation amongst all stakeholders is a key ingredient in all of this.
I think that's a very important point to close at, because it links up with what I picked from everyone else here. Mogeza talked about the tracker, which allowed people who would naturally be competitors, but cooperating, as you're saying, sharing information. You talked about the stress that the sector was under, but was able to really survive that, which is you can argue a definition of resilience. Information sharing and communication. So I think you have raised some important points, but Fedi, I want to take up from where you were mentioning about the vulnerable members of our society, because I have 2 questions. One, which I'll just bring it under one, from Andres Fori as well as Siatla Nkosi. And what they want to know is precisely around that, the population dynamics. We know the nature of our country in terms of poverty dynamics, inequality, and the job losses you mentioned. That's what Fori wants to know. And the question is, during this period, but most importantly, going forward, is that how did we do in terms of servicing as well as protecting the vulnerable members of our society? So the population dynamics around that and the distribution. But going forward, because the fact that the sector did well, it is not an indication that we address all challenges, because we have not. We still have a lot. But how do we use this as a springboard, to go forward to make sure that we address such issues? So the population dynamics in terms of high end and low end, as well as jobs were lost. I don't think we have the last tally, and we're not sure whether as we go further or we get outside the situation, there will be no further job losses. And these are, I think, real life situations, right? So the sector, how did it do in that context? Anyone want to start? Maybe Tracy, because you had a chart presenting about poverty in urban centers versus rural and so forth. I'll give you that opportunity to go first.
Okay. So maybe I can start. I can start with some hard numbers, because the great team behind this has actually made some calculations for us since
Awesome.
that question came in. So unfortunately, with respect to income numbers, we don't have such high frequency data. So we don't necessarily have updated data with respect to the impact that COVID had on that number. But if we look pre-COVID, if you look at the lower poverty boundary in urban centres, so that's looking at an income of around 4,800 Rand a month, about 19% of the urban population falls underneath that. If you go up to the higher poverty boundary, which is around 9,500 Rand a month, then you're looking at about 25% of the urban population that sits below that. So around 75% of the urban population would be sitting above that poverty number. Of course, we know that the impact of COVID, the additional job losses, that number would change, but at least that gives us a reasonable starting point.
Perhaps if I may jump in on there, because this is a question that probably some people are having in mind. We are sitting here talking about the great fruits of agriculture, but there are still these millions of people that are going to bed without food out there. The question then is, what are the issues? And I think there we need to be careful not to put a lot of pressure on agriculture, because one of the key issues that contributes to this is people being generally out of employment with other sectors, because it's no longer the issue of maybe pricing of food or anything. Now the question is to say, how does each sector play a part to absorb as many people as they can, so that tomorrow they can be able to afford all of these foods that we are talking about here. And I think on that point, this seems soft, but I think it is crucial. This issue of PPP, that we have seen all of this energy of business and private sector and society working together during the pandemic. I think that's the energy we need to capitalize on, not only on agriculture, but also in other sectors of the economy going forward.
I think on a broader basis, Matlo, if you look at the concept that was introduced by Wandile now, he talks about affordability. The inverse of it is that we also need to look at the availability of food. If you look at the stats, you have got 40,000 commercial farmers. You have got 300,000 smallholder farmers, and you have got almost 2.3 million subsistence farmers. What is that we can do to ensure that the production at these other two spheres of smallholder and subsistence comes in to make that cushion in terms of those who are in the rural spaces? And the importance of now going to household food security, ensuring that there is availability of food and feed also at that level is very important, because you need to have both a protein source at that particular level. So I think our argument and our debate should also center around how do we deal with issues around food availability outside of the affordability space, and ensure that we also touch base on issue around inclusivity, because most of the time when you talk about this sector, we're talking about a sector where we paint a picture of prosperity, but in terms of participation, there are issues that we also have got to deal with.
Matlo, if I can add
Yes,
these
please.
two concepts, and it links back to this, what we presented as a portfolio approach, or I think we need to debate this and think about this in terms of development, where we talked about the broadening of the base, exactly to Moketsa's point. How can we make this, we have the big numbers, so the employment numbers that we can really kick, and it comes out of the NDP, is in that space where we can grow the base broader. In other words, with the smallholders and the household farms, how can we boost productivity? If you go into the value chain and go and look at our food system, there are the bigger markets in the urban centers where you need big volumes of food and you need it cost effective, to your point, accessible and affordable. And this is where you need this portfolio approach, where you need your large scale commercial, your medium, your large scale. So you need this whole portfolio approach. We need to figure out the support at each level and then combine those levels then with the food system. And this is where also the markets come into play. There's the dynamics between local and international. So export markets, we need to look beyond our local borders. We have to grow in exports because our market is simply, otherwise we're going to cap the growth opportunities and the jobs that we can create in these sectors. Not only on primary products, but also the opportunity of processed products. We can push that. This does not mean that we exclude the local markets, and local markets both in the urban and the rural areas. So if we split those out and if we really focus on what are the opportunities in exports, local, rural, and formal, informal, and really start to focus and narrow down, is it capital, is it infrastructure, is it extension services, these preconditions that we need to focus on. They're actually very value chain specific and product specific.
Okay. Well, and I think that's also, a key point in those, rural, informal and formal value chain is that, you can't have a system that fits all possibilities. And some of the weaknesses that were exposed was the fact that the areas that you're talking about, fairly informal and rural, the infrastructure as well as these value chains were not as strong as, in the mainstream value chains. Urban centers, there was food, there was enough products, but sometimes it is the movement into these other areas that are underserviced, and I think is an important thing that, going forward we must look into. But the one point that I think I cannot leave it without a discussion is that the agriculture and agro-processing master plans, came during the presentation. And for me, they also highlighted a higher priority area, at least in the context of where government is looking, is doing, and is also setting a base for now and going forward to some degree addressing some of these, challenges, even though I understand that the design came prior to the pandemic. But how important is this, and what kind of support would be needed? As you were saying, agriculture alone is not going to address the issues. Government alone is not going to solve all problems. Neither can private sector on its own deal with these issues. But how do we unpack this going forward to address some of the issues that we just said, are there and have been there for a long period? Wandile, you seem to be interested in taking the first shot.
No, I mean, I'm interested because I think this story of the master plan is very important, not only on a recovery, because we are growing as the sector, but for me, it begins to introduce an important dynamics which Freddie had referred to on, because if you look at it at the design, it talks about the areas which have a growth potential. Your Eastern Cape, KZN, Limpopo, that is what the master plan is looking at. And I think we need to look at it with the same energy, private sector as well as government, to say how do we meet each other halfway on really unlocking growth as well as job creation in those areas. I think that master plan is crucial.
Yeah, so the opportunities for investment, isn't it, Wandile? If we can have this in an environment where, and there was a question on it, I think John Purchase asked it also in the feed. Yes. We was asking, how do we had this example of pork, the informal sector, when we did this analysis on African swine fever, and we looked at how big are potentially those numbers, and that informal sector, it's big. There's a lot of things happening there. Question is, a lot of times people, they're operating in an economy that's not well tracked. And the question is, can we do more in those economies and actually commercialize and formalize and grow those specific sectors? And that's, I think, where this partnership that you're talking about between government and private sectors coming in. So I think on John's question on how can we generate more of that data, it's a crucial component, and that all researchers, we think we need to sit around a table and really look at available data, and maybe Stats SA can also help to triangulate and bring forth more the opportunities that are sitting in these sectors that we are not delving into.
Okay. Now the admission, I think, is there in terms of the data gaps that we are having. If you look at the agricultural census by Stats SA 2017, and you look at the analysis that was done for 2020 by BFAP, you realize that there are those what I would call minor industries that we still have got data that we can deal with. But coming back to the master plan, I think the biggest issue is around social compacting between industry, labor, and communities, to ensure that whatever that we agree on would be sector-wide and would tie us for a foreseeable future, specifically with the different depositions that we have got to do for the NDP. I think it goes in line with what we have been doing as government, starting from the Badat days, going to the sector plans, now going to the AMP. I think that once we compact, we will be able to then drag everybody within the industry towards achieving the goals that we have always been aspiring to achieve.
Okay. So I'm happy that you see it as an extension as well as an implementation almost plan of the NDP, because people are concerned that it is one of those documents that gathers dust. But anyway, we're about to run out of time, so maybe I should just go around and ask in 20 to 30 seconds, just to give the main highlight. I mean, there's plenty, just the main highlight of this baseline for this year. I'll start on my left and going around. Tracy, you have plenty, but just one.
So I think I've already spoken for more than an hour about the baseline, so I probably don't have a lot to add. But to me, it's just to highlight the positive aspect. Agriculture's performance, I think, especially this year in a really difficult environment, is really something to be commended. And I think, to latch on to points that have already been made, the opportunity to pick up, to keep the momentum in terms of the public-private partnerships that ran through this crisis, and to make sure we utilize that to ignite growth going forward.
Wandile?
For me, agriculture has a potential. That's what I pick up from the baseline. But there are certain key prerequisites which I think all stakeholders need to confront and be open and work on those prerequisites in order to achieve the growth prospects that we all think of.
All right. Freddie, your turn.
I'll link on to Wandile, and I'll say those prerequisites, we need to implement them. Otherwise, we will see a baseline growth, which we're projecting to be relatively flat. So we'll have this nice spike of weather-induced output, a nice shock on depreciation of the exchange rate, but we'll come back to slower growth numbers unless if we implement these preconditions that Wandile was talking about.
Okay, and Mogeza, your last word.
Yes, my last word would be agriculture is growing. In its growth comes expectations from all people who are participating that there would be changes in terms of transformation within the sector. And there is presentation in terms of the data that we are having that we can transform and ensure that agriculture grows for all who are within our sector. To ensure that within the value chains we have got maximum participation of black people.
Okay, thanks very much. I think I got the picture, and in summary, it's partnership, it's prerequisites, it's investment and transformation for inclusive participation and inclusive growth. So I think I would like to end it right here. I think we've gone over time, but your inputs were very valuable.